but the core of the business is really compliance, compliant development, support for compliant development, and eventually the regulatory submissions that come with medical device. But we like to start with regulatory strategy, which we think is the foundation of all of that. Before you get into the weeds, to have a plan and to have a strategy and to have a roadmap. The title of this talk is the longest one I've ever put together. So it's a mouthful, but my contention here, I'm going to try to convince you, is that the very, very difficult challenge of adoption in our field is very closely tied to these two things. So not regulatory clearance or approval notice, I said, but regulatory strategy and clinical integration that we're definitely going to be talking about. Okay. So we had this in the kind of banner to promote the discussion today, and I'm leading with it. Probably a bit dramatic, and you read different things that say 5% or 10%, and it's a little bit of a shock to get your attention, but it also happens to be true in the startup community. Now, we are in the startup community here in this context, and I think you may not be surprised, and also happy to be reminded, that most of the medtech innovation going on right now is being done by startups because it's risky and it's innovative and it's cutting edge and it breaks models. And even when big players are involved in, I don't mean new kind of development, but I mean investing in emerging tech, real difficult innovation, most often they do it through acquisition. That might be part of your strategy. But 5 to 10% on average, year over year, from what we're reading, of startups actually make it. And when I say make it, I certainly don't mean regulatory clearance. I mean to actually be adopted in the clinical setting and start making real inroads. Now, traditional medical device is well known and well understood. It's careful, it's slow. Typical benchmarks for a class 2 in the US are from R&D to actual market sales 5 to 8 years for a class 2. Some of your investors might want to see things happen faster than that. Typically for a class 3, 8 to 13 years. Those are excruciating timelines in technology development, aren't they? In traditional medical device, the pathways are well known and well understood. When you're disrupting something like health technology, you're looking at things that involve emerging tech like Bluetooth, like handheld devices, like applications on a smartphone. I mean, this was exciting 10 years ago. We're 10 years in, this is by no means ubiquitous. We've been looking at medical imaging on software for years, but processing it with AI, artificial intelligence, and machine learning is another level. So understanding the factors involved are also causing a lot of challenges. And as soon as we talk about home use, we've opened a very, very complex and risky can of worms. So this is the cardiac mobile device from AliveCor. It measures a 6-lead medical grade ECG. 2 of the leads you can see on your fingers, and there's an electrode on the back that sits on your thigh and gives you that 3rd lead. So it's a 6-channel EEG, medical grade. But the use case here is so different from any other EKG that the medical community is aware of that the challenges are great. So here's the pitch to an investor. The runway is long, the cash burn is very, very high. I just told you the roads are 5 to 8 years, 8 to 13 years. Do you want it? It's a tough pitch, what you guys have to do. And you're a little further ahead than some of the really, really early stage companies. But for medical device startups, if you're not looking at something big and heavy and complex like regulatory strategy in a round appropriate way, then you're back in the traditional medtech bucket, and it's probably not serving you the way you need it to. It needs to be lean and iterative and efficient, and you don't necessarily have all the knowledge, and you don't necessarily have all the people on the team that you need. So how do you integrate that incrementally as part of your challenge? And like I said, emerging tech comes with not just unknowns, because all tech comes with unknowns, but risk that is seen at all levels. Technology risks, clinical risks, regulatory risks, Everybody is seeing emerging tech as risky. So how to manage that when you're not just disrupting tech, but you're disrupting everything. You're disrupting how it's used, you're disrupting maybe who it's helping, you're disrupting how it gets integrated into clinical workflow. You're hoping to disrupt outcomes, aren't you? Or else, why are we here? That's a tall order. So how do you mitigate the risk for investors? How do you put a pitch together, well, that's compelling and gets them into a second meeting? You know how to do that. How do you get them into a third meeting? You also know how to do that. But once you're in that kind of due diligence when they're looking at your plan, we always get the same question. The investors asked us, how are you going to mitigate risk with the FDA? And what's your go-to-market strategy? It's A and B of all. Okay, so you're nodding and smiling. So you've heard it already. Those are very difficult questions to answer at early stages. So, what we want to know is, when do we start talking? This is an international context here where we worry about Health Canada and the FDA and the CE mark in Europe. But in your case here, when do you come out of regulatory stealth? So we're often asked, when should we talk to the FDA? Should we, I often hear, pass under the radar? Is it a good idea that the FDA knows about us? And we'll talk about that a little bit more today. But some of the things that you can consider for mitigating the risk are what we like to call intermediate milestones. Like clearance is a long road. Go-to-market is a long road. It's not good enough anymore for investors for you to say, well, we're happy to have you on the team, and we should be showing you results in 5 to 8 years. It's an awful proposition. So what are the kinds of intermediate milestones that can help mitigate regulatory risk? Well, we'll talk about pre-submission meetings, getting in contact with the FDA early, having them understand who you are and what you're doing, and learning if you're on the right path. And there's a way to do that we'll talk about. Beyond the MVP, device certifications are critical because you can't get into a real clinical context if your device is not just developed following standards, but certified by third party, accredited third party to standard. Beyond the pilot study where you had good early results, what is the clinical validation plan? What are the endpoints that are going to take us to the clinical evidence we need to get that clearance that's going to get us to market? Do we need an ITA as a Canada, Health Canada reference, but do we need an IDE-based study? Can we get that data with lower hanging fruit? All questions that as an investor, I don't know I need to know yet. But you can educate them by giving them early risk mitigation strategies like that. And what do I mean when I say emerging tech brings all kinds of new requirements? Well, AI and machine learning is a different, it's not new. It's been around since the 50s. As an engineer, I learned about it in the 90s. But now applied to health technology in the context of actually diagnosing or formatting images or reviewing case file, it becomes a different proposition. And you will encounter one or all of these for sure now that we're taking the device out of the hospital potentially into new contexts. Usability, cybersecurity, all the devices are connected. And biocompatibility if you have a hardware device that makes contact with the patient. Even more complicated if you're going into an OR. Again, traditional medical device companies are very used to biocompatibility. It can be excruciating for a startup. And your go-to-market strategy. Often we hear, is there a code? Do you have a reimbursement code? Famous question. Well, if you have a code, you're off to the races. It's much more complex than that. And I'm not going to pretend to be a reimbursement specialist, but what I do know is code is just the beginning. And there are different types of codes for clinical investigation, for temporary assessments, for going to CMS and requesting the development of a new code takes 3 to 5 years. Again, very difficult proposition. But we also need to understand coverage and payments for the method of action of your device. And that is closely related, intimately related, inextricably related to the intended use that you present to the FDA. So doing reimbursement and regulatory disjointedly is a terrible idea. But again, as I said, you don't have all these resources from day one. So how do you manage that together? The idea is to have an incremental strategy where you're learning as you go, and answering questions as you learn more. And this is the big one, I think. We're going to talk about it. But clinical workflow integration, I'm not inventing it, but my contention is it's one of the biggest barriers to the actual adoption that we're seeking. And we're going to talk about some real examples. So as I said, regulated medical device, regulated AI and machine learning is quite a complex proposition. Of course, we're going to want you to be an ISO 13485 at least compliant, or MD-SAB compliant or certified company. Why? Because you'll have all that rigor and accountability built in to your company. So it's not about documentation. It's not that simple and it's not that exciting, but it really is about accountability and reliability. The agencies want to know that. It doesn't matter where you're selling. And don't forget that a lot of countries internationally expect you to have regulatory clearance or registration in your home country before you go abroad. So understanding those requirements is critical, to the extent that the FDA, Health Canada, and the MHRA in the UK collaborated on a good machine learning practice manifesto that's only 2 pages. But it outlines some critical things to consider. So if you're developing AI and ML into your medical device, it would be good to know what those are. And I bet you know some of them, but it'd be nice to have the entire checklist covered. Now, you're never going to get away from making sure you've got good data. We talk about the model. Where's your data coming from? Is it good data? That data integrity is critical. The agencies care about it, but you should care about it even more. The classic question we like to ask the FDA is, how many patients do I need in my clinical evidence? We're going to talk about representativity, which is understanding how much data you need to represent your intended population. And the FDA will not answer you. The answer is 8 billion. Does it work with everybody? You need to be able to show that representativity in your AI model and in your clinical data. Ground truth is critical. So if you have a model that you're just throwing data at and saying, well, the model will figure it out, it's a mistake. You need to understand what you're looking for before the model starts looking for it. And there are cases with deep learning where it's critical that the model learns more than the engineers do. And there are techniques without ground truth to ensure that you understand what your model is doing. Before going to the FDA, believe me, they have AI people in the meetings. You're going to want to be able to talk to them about that. Because what they care about is, how is it going to act when it goes into the real world? Is it robust? And keep in mind that we've got open models and we've got closed models. So supervised learning and unsupervised learning, we're not at that stage yet where the robots are taking over. All of the devices, AI-based, that have been regulated are absolutely supervised. The models have been closed and they're not learning in the field. We're not there yet, and we're far from it. Is that the future? I don't know yet. But the challenge is this. What makes us beautiful is what makes AI in healthcare so complicated. So it might work on the bench, it might work in the pilot study, but you haven't seen the next patient yet that'll break the model. So understanding the diversity of your patient population is the #1 factor in AI development. The good news, I hope this isn't controversial, is in our infamous Gartner new technology hype curve, I think we're still very much here. So we've got a little bit of time. Now, how many devices, software devices, are AI-based that have been cleared by the FDA? Hundreds. 75% of them, give or take, are in radiology. Another 15 or so are in cardiology. So if you're breaking grounds on a neurology application that's AI-based, you're in the less than 4% of cleared devices in the US. So you've got some time. And that's a useful thing to tell investors. We're not just cutting edge. We're not just learning. We're 4% of the FDA right now. Give us a break. Give us a little bit of time. Okay. So, how does the regulatory strategy that I'm preaching here tie into the business? Well, we know very well that your registration, your clearance or approval with the FDA are going to dictate the marketing claims that you can make. So it's a misnomer to say that we're FDA cleared or that we have FDA clearance, even though that's a term that we use to talk about the review of your submission. But what you're granted is a market authorization. You're granted the right to sell health technology to the clinical world. How do they control what you do and what you say is through your marketing claim. So the mistake that we sometimes make is to say, well, what class should we be because the regulatory burden will be less and we'll be able to do that faster. My answer is, where is the business? I don't think I'm telling you something you don't know. But I like to look at it the other way around, especially because we have a regulatory mandate. I like to support the business rather than dictate it. I don't want to tell people that are making business decisions on the front lines, selling and working with clinicians, I don't want to tell them where their limits are. I want them to tell me what regulatory backing they need to be able to do that. So where's the business you need to be? Should we be a class 2 or should we get away with being a class 1? Where's the business is the first place you start. What claims do you need to make to sell the device? The regulatory strategy should support the business strategy. And then as a business owner, managing teams and managing resources and managing the finances and pitching to investors and growing the business, what are you balancing? Well, you're balancing that claim to regulatory burden through the clinical application. So you want to address the clinical need, you have to make certain claims. If you have to make certain claims at a certain level, then you have to show the evidence to get there. Can you get away with less evidence? If you reduce the claims, is there business at that level? That's the cycle that you've always got to balance. And is there an incremental strategy? Is that my next point? Yeah. If there's an incremental strategy, then you need to figure it out. You can't just invent one and say, well, we'll start with a class 1, and then as we move up in evidence, we'll raise the claims to a class 2. You won't be able to do that if there's no business with a class 1. The market will dictate whether you have an incremental strategy. But as an investor, I'd like to know if you have one, because they're going to tell you. Can you just release the app without the device? Can you release the device and the app without connecting it to the cloud? The business needs to drive that, and that's the clinical use case, right? So on to the clinical use case. Clinical adoption for me, I think all of us in the room understand we're talking about that use case, that application of your technology. And with that comes usability. Will they understand? Are our instructions clear? Will they know what to do with the software? Will they know what to do with the buttons on the screen? Will they get paid for using it? We understand those things. What I want to open up today is a little bit more kind of hidden in the sense that once you have the experience, you start to realize how important it is and how obvious it was. But maybe as a first-time founder, it's not so clear. We all know we need KOLs. We all know we have to be speaking to the medical community and they have to be helping us. Our chief medical officer is probably one of those KOLs. But our advisors, certainly, there's at least 1 or 2 of them. My contention for clinical adoption is beyond the pilot study, beyond helping you with features and showing you how the clinical application of your device is going to work. You need to create champions in the field that are going to pull your tech towards their colleagues. And those are the most important KOLs when we talk about clinical adoption, because those are the ones that are going to tell you, this is who you need to speak to in my center. I'm going to curate that meeting for you. Otherwise, you're guessing because it's different in every center. And are you publishing, or does it contradict your IP strategy? Why is that important? Obviously, the investors want to know where your IP is and how it's protected, and publishing kind of doesn't necessarily directly contradict that, but it challenges it. So are you publishing or are you patenting? How are you protecting what you're releasing to the market? Well, if you're not publishing, medical doctors who don't understand your technology are going to find it harder to understand if they can trust it. So publishing is a major part of the clinical adoption strategy. It might be complicated within your IP context. If I were in your shoes, I would want to know that sooner rather than later. And workflow is the big one. How are devices purchased in the clinical center? Acquisition, decommissioning, I'm going to talk specifically about that in one of the case studies. Are payers involved in the discussion or just providers? The challenge is that it's different in every center. So, can your device, you have a good clinical application, you're going to validate it and do usability testing and do clinical validation and show that it works. But what do I mean by can it actually be used in a clinical environment is how is it integrated into their workflow? Into the workflow of the people that are actually going to use it. Is it going to solve problems or actually create more? And these people work every day in a very high pace, very intense environment. They're under stress and they don't have a lot of time. And you're telling them that your device is going to change their lives in a positive way, but it breaks all their models. They don't make decisions about whether they have budget for it the way you want them to. They don't do acquisition the way you think. How do they train staff? Are they running around the hospital with your equipment in a different way than they normally deliver equipment? So what does deployment look like? Is it integrated into the EHR? How many times are you going to talk about that over the next 10 years? Well, if it isn't, how is that data from your device going to make it into the hands that it needs to make it in? So the mistake that we make is to hold up our phone and say, well, the doctor uses it like this, and then they measure the patient. It's not how they do the clinical application of that technology, and doctors don't usually measure stuff. They usually interpret things. So how do you get the data from the person who's measured it to the doctor who has to interpret it? And of course, cybersecurity and HIPAA are huge now that we're mobile and cloud connected. So before I go into 3 very specific case studies, are there any questions so far?
Unless one of your case studies will look at
Sure.
this, but you mentioned the regulatory stealth. We've already had our FDA meeting, but I was curious if you could provide any examples of kind of situations where it's beneficial to not.
Yeah. So the misconception is that the FDA is the police. And they're going to find out what we're doing, and that's going to be more challenging for us. And I was speaking to Alex from Stroke DX earlier, and he said they get a bad rap. They want to help, right? So when is the right time to speak to them? The wrong time to speak to them is if you're not ready. What does that mean? The idea of speaking to the FDA is you think, well, we're making something, we're going to ask them what we need to do. And that's absolutely the wrong way to approach it. So asking them an open-ended question is the best way to raise risk because it shows that you don't know and it puts the onus on them. So as regulators, the risk goes straight up. What you want to do is make sure that you understand your technology and the factors involved. You have a very clear idea of what the FDA refers to as the DDP, which is your data development plan. And you want to make sure that you're laying it out for them and asking them what aspects of it they agree with or what they would change. But never, how many patients should we measure? Should we do this kind of study? More like, this is what we're planning at each stage. Do you agree with our list of standards for non-clinical testing? This is what we're planning in our pilot study. Do you agree with the endpoints at that stage of our development? It's very, very specific. And we'll look at one of the case studies where you can also tell them too much. Great question. Any others? Yeah.
So if you're in a space where others have gone before you, can you just use them as a predicate, as part of this conversation? And are they willing to acknowledge that? Or do they treat your case as a standalone, like we've never seen anything like it before in our lives? You're brand new, we're treating you special. Or, I mean, knowing that others have come before you, you just have a different.
It's another really, really good question because in the 510K context, the entire, concept of risk management is based on that predicate, right? So the FDA is giving you an accelerated pathway because they're saying we understand the factors involved with that device. So in terms of showing substantial equivalence to the predicate, you want to do that as closely as possible. But what they did got them to market safely. You have to show that you're also ready to do that, and they won't talk about another manufacturer in a pre-submission meeting. So what you can do, and it's usually our first question, we've identified this product code, we believe these predicate candidates are solid, we do a draft substantial equivalence and say, do you agree with our choice of product code and substantial equivalence for the given predicate candidates? They'll say yes or no. But after that, they won't tell you, well, they tested this in this way. It's up to you to understand that you have to meet the non-clinical data and clinical data evidence requirements for the FDA.
So let me give you an example specific to me. I'm
Sure.
a catheter heart valves. And we have other competitors that are similar devices, but not what we do.
Sure.
That have a certain number of cases that they've done for PMA, and we're targeting that right now. That's our basis for how we're moving forward for our pivotal study. We're saying 150 patients because this company
Right.
did it 2 years ago. This is what they did.
Right.
Is that a legitimate approach, or do they treat it as, no, you're going to be doing 150
Okay.
patients?
Another,
That's substantiated as if we've
Yeah,
never seen it before.
I appreciate the specificity because practically speaking, what do? Right? So that's a great question. Again, you said it. We're similar, but we're not exactly the same. So what the FDA does with your device is they look very closely at what's the same as the predicate. They make sure they understand how you're showing that, and they understand those risks and check those off. But in terms of the gaps, it's your responsibility to show the evidence for the safety and efficacy of those gaps. Now, there's a few things. One, your gaps may lead to different clinical requirements. Your labeling may be different in the sense that you have a very similar patient population, but a little bigger. So if your predicate was limited to, males 50 and over, and you're saying, well, we want males and females 40 and over, you can still use that predicate, but you're going to have to show your own clinical data for that gap in the patient population. So that's a small example of how you can start to extrapolate gaps and have to show your own evidence. There's another thing that's very important is that the predicate has been on the market. So it behooves you to know as much about it as possible before you talk to the FDA, meaning first place you go is to the MOD database and understand if there's any events that were reported on that device, right? And they may have corrected it and moved on, but it differs from their submission now because it's real time, right? So the FDA's understanding of that product is available to you, and the FDA's understanding of the technology used in the clinical space has evolved without documentation, unfortunately. So that's up to you to show. Does that make
They
sense?
will acknowledge it.
It's a starting point, put it that way. You won't, what I mean is you can't, the answer to your question is no, in the sense that they did 150, should we do 150? They won't say yes. They'll say, are you representative for these gaps in your substantial equivalence? Does that make sense? It's a pain in the ass, I get it. It's a pain in the butt, I get it. The idea is you want a clear answer. You need to show responsible representativity. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And Alex will also tell you this, when you get to the end of the back and forth in the question, they'll say, it sounds pretty good today, but we'll review it at submission, right? So that their answer makes it into the minutes and that's official, but they also need to understand that you might be submitting a year and a half later, and you might have changed all kinds of ideas by the time you submit it. So they won't commit to the legitimacy of a future submission. They'll commit to the question you're asking that day, but they know you're going to evolve. And by the time they see the submission, it'll be a bit different. But why do we like pre-submissions? Because early on, it tells you if you're on the right track at least. That's critical. So you can look on the internet, you can look through the FDA database, you can speak to consultants, and you can get all kinds of different understandings and all kinds of different answers. And the difference in the future could be significant. So we like to check in and say, these are our assumptions. This is what we understand. Do you agree? A yes from the FDA can go a long way to pointing you in the right direction. And an official yes from the FDA is on paper. You can show that to an investor. We don't have clearance, but we certainly have a check mark from the FDA that our strategy is on track. That's better than nothing in an 8-year timeline. Now, the other reason I like it is because it introduces you to the FDA. So they know about your company, they know about the people in your company, and they know about your technology. Often, if you get it done quickly enough, the same people, or at least a subgroup of those people, are going to be reviewing your submission. But don't forget that their feedback either way makes it into the minutes. So if you're prepared, and you're confident and you're ready, addressing the FDA is a very, very good early step. I recommend it to everybody. Unless there's a very easy substantial equivalence to a predicate, it's non-controversial, and you've got all the boxes ticked and you think it's pretty straightforward. But why not check with them? Because it's free and it just takes 75 to 90 days to wait for a meeting. It's a 1-hour meeting. If you've got questions, prepare well and ask them. Great questions. So here are 3 case studies for how these kinds of things factor into actual practical results and how they actually affect your bottom line. The first one is a handheld portable imaging device, and I'm going to tell you about how they got clinical workflow integration wrong. The second one is a piece of software, AI-based, as an aid in diagnostic, and I'm going to tell you how they got the pre-submission wrong. And the third is an implantable cardiac device that's at the top of the food chain in terms of risk, class 3, and unfortunately, they provided the FDA with an incomplete DDP. They didn't go far enough in their data development, and they submitted a pre-IDE, and it was a huge, huge challenge to turn it around. So the first one is a handheld device. It's supposed to disrupt an imaging technology. And they got FDA clearance, and I thought they were off to the races. What ended up happening was that it took them a lot longer to start selling devices than they thought, which is very, very typical, which is why I talk about clinical adoption. So how I came across them was very, very practical. It's a very true anecdote. I was contacted by an organization of clinical engineers that said, could you talk about wearables at our conference and kind of tell us what's coming down the pipe? And I thought, I think they're saying wearables, but they mean new tech. They mean emerging tech. What should they be preparing for? I said, why are you asking? And they said, because often a physician will come back from a conference and they'll have a question about some device and they'll ask us if we can integrate it. But this one in particular came in with the actual device. And it was in his pocket, and he said, can I use this? And I said, oh, great. That device was just FDA cleared. It's phenomenal. What did you say? And he said, I said, no. I said, why'd you say no? And I thought it was really, really interesting. It was a true story. I was on the phone with him. And he said, well, I said no because I didn't know what the heck it was. Well, it does this imaging. And he said, great. How did he buy it? Did he put the app on his own cell phone, or do I need 250 cell phones? How do I charge these things? Do they come with charge bays? Is there an enterprise solution? Did he create the cloud account with his own email, or do I have to create enterprise emails? And I just thought, those are all great points. And he said, plus we just ordered 250 XYZ machines that have been installed, trained, and clinical workflow, and the decommissioning is 3 to 5 years. So we're not even looking for this technology until 2020, whatever. And I thought we never talk about that stuff. We just talk about how cool the features are and how it's going to disrupt the clinical space. So I was kind of shocked at the practicality of his argument. And the last thing he said really, really surprised me. He said, and I didn't even know if it was Health Canada or FDA. And I said, but you're a clinical engineer in a clinical center. How could you not know that? He said, I don't know how to look for that. I said, well, did you read the instructions? He said, I didn't even open the box. I just said no. And then it occurred to me that he's used to dealing with Cardinal Health and Medtronic and Siemens. He doesn't have to ask if it's FDA cleared. It's obvious. It wouldn't be in his context if it wasn't. So now these devices are showing up, and he said, I don't even know what the heck that is. Now, you can't make this up. It's my favorite anecdote, and if you get to know me, you're going to hear it 100 times. You're going to say, he's telling the story again. But I met the VP of sales of that company a little while later, and I ran to him and I said, what happened? And he said, exactly what you think. We got FDA clearance and we didn't sell a unit. And I said, what did you do? And he said, well, we learned, we asked questions, and we figured it out, and we finally put a team on site. And they were in a major hospital center in a big, big state that has 10 clinics in every major city, the biggest pediatric hospital in the US. And they said, we put a 5-person team on site. We had an engineer, we had an IT technician, we had a physician, we had a radiologist, and we had the sales rep. And they're there every day doing integration and training. I said, how long were they there? What do you think? How long were they there? What do you think?
8 months.
8 months. Great answer. Dragana.
2 years.
2 years. They were there a year. And I thought, 5 people, 3 meals a day, 5 hotel rooms, they were on site for a year. And I I couldn't get enough of this story because I thought, that's how hard it is. That's great. And I said, did it work? He said, after a year, we finally started selling units. And I said, and then what? And he said, we had to start over at Cleveland Clinic. And then we had to start over at Mass General. So there are things you can learn that can make it adaptable, but it's not scalable very easily. That's when I realized how integral clinical workflow integration is. I'll move to the next one. Any question? Okay. So this one is close to my heart. This is just a generic image, of course, but it's an AI-based imaging processing software platform that aims to revolutionize diagnostics in a very specific area. Now, they came to us after having a pre-submission meeting with the FDA that was challenging. And the risk level came back as high as it could. They said the FDA sent us back to the drawing board. They said we need a ton of clinical data. And they were very concerned about a specific topic. And I thought I knew this company before they had gone to the FDA. And they were working with a major US outfit, 600 US an hour for these consultants. And we were a little bit intimidated. I'm telling you the true story. And I thought, you know what? Go with them. Let us know how it goes. And if you need our support, we'll be there. You know, they came back to us a year later. The FDA had tied them up. And when I looked at what they did, I couldn't believe it. They had sent hundreds and hundreds of pages to the FDA. And this was all curated by the consultant that was actually an author on the guidance they were using because they were an ex-FDA regulator. And we thought, it's perfect. They know the business of regulation inside and out. Well, it turns out they were very focused on regulation, not so much on regulatory strategy, meaning what do we need to talk about and what answer do we want to get from the FDA? It was more like, how do we regulate this thing? And when I saw what they sent to the FDA, I couldn't believe it. It was reams of paper. The FDA went through all of it. The feedback was enormous, 35 questions to answer. And there was one specific detail that they went down a rabbit hole so far that it was very difficult for us to untangle it. But they got onto a clinical metric that was controversial between the physician society and the FDA and what they were proposing. And here's what I learned. The FDA got excited about their technology because it was groundbreaking. But they got too excited. So they started to push for this company to drive the development of this change, and the burden was enormous. It took us an entire year to scale back the intended use of the claims and go back to the FDA. They said, when can we go back to the FDA? I said, we have to do the work. We went back a year later and sent them 25 pages. And it came back with, you've got some work to do. But it was very specific. We'd like to see some technical ground truth verification on the engineering side, and we'd like some more patients from different sites. Very straightforward. And now we're off to the races. So how can you get a pre-submission wrong? It's delicate because you're at customs. You're with the customs agent and your suitcase is open. If you don't know what you're allowed to cross the border with and you don't know how to answer questions from the customs agent, that could be a very bad experience, right? And the last one.
Excuse me.
Yes, please.
On that last case, when you resubmitted with the shorter submission, did you change the claims?
Oh, absolutely. We scaled back the intended use significantly. So much so, which is the side of the intended use barrier I'd rather be on, so much so that they said, well, if it doesn't do anything, what do we do with it? And I thought, okay, I'd rather have that discussion than this is extremely risky because it's revolutionizing clinical care. I'd rather say, well, let's inch up the report metrics a little bit and give a little bit more instruction to the clinician. What I loved about that conversation was it was the physician on the pre-sub call that let us go 55 minutes, and the last 5 minutes said, I have a question. What do I do with that report? And we said, well, you continue to monitor and look for clinical signs, but at least you've got an indication that you need to look for something in the existing clinical data. And she said, sounds like you need to think about your instructions to the physician a bit better, but I'd rather be on the safer side. We walked down the claims and the intended use significant. But the metric is still relevant. And now the onus is on the company to really understand what to do with that metric clinically. And I think that's a better proposition to be in than showing the FDA thousands of patient data when, it's very hard to come by and very expensive.
Okay, so say you had already gone through that process and you knew that. Now you go in with this intended use that's completely pared down. You don't even know if there's a market. How do you sell that to your investors?
That's great. Another great question. We're back to that balance.
Yeah,
Balance. You need to make sure that scale back doesn't, remember what I talked about on that balance slide, doesn't knock you out of the market. So we worked very closely with the clinical leaders and the salespeople, by the way, to say, can you sell those claims? And they said, look, if you give me this metric, I can work with it. And then we get into the KOL network, and I don't mean 1 or 2 physicians, I mean 25 physicians all across the country, and said, what do you need? And we said, well, yeah, we can work with that if you show us what to do, but the reports are phenomenal, and what this physician is doing with it, he's the physician inventor, is phenomenal. They want to hear from him. So what we did was we stepped up his education. We got him on more platforms, and we got him talking more, and there were videos of him on YouTube. And the physicians need to understand what to do with that report. If you water it down completely, it becomes useless. You're right. That balance is critical. Was it Alex or was it, yeah?
Yeah, I was curious. So then from that more, I guess, watered down submission, has that company submitted a real application yet or no?
We haven't yet, but what's amazing is they've realized that they have incremental products in that extremely complex library of algorithms that are all different indications that they can build. And there's a very simple measurement one that can go 510K. And all of a sudden we opened up a 510K. And then we wouldn't have realized that had we been focusing so hard on the de novo. So it opened up the company's thinking. Now they have a very exciting product roadmap, and investors are jumping on those early milestones. Great question. Does that make sense? Okay, so the last one is very, very complex, and we're okay on time, actually. I know you have to get back to the conference, so this is the last one. The last one is an implantable stimulating device. So at the top of the food chain for complexity and risk and clinical and non-clinical evidence. Now, they had planned a big study. They had done all their safety, they had done all their biocompatibility and their sterility, they had done their animal testing, and they were ready to go to an IDE because obviously it's a significant risk study. It was an IDE exempt by any means, the exact opposite. And they had submitted a pre-IDE, again, working with a major outfit in the US that bumped up all the documentation and made a major submission. And it came back with 40 points to review. So we were brought in because we're digital and we're emerging tech, and they thought, could you help us with the software part? By the way, that's something I haven't mentioned yet, is when you're dealing with traditional hardware-based structures like meeting standards and data development plans that are based on hardware, it's counterintuitive, but moving to a software-based one is actually more complicated. It's actually more difficult, I should say. So people that have come up in the ranks in hardware find regulating and testing software more difficult. And I work in software, I think it's much easier. But showing safety and efficacy in software for them is a challenge. So what do? They come up with all the hardware-based stuff and just change hardware for software, and it doesn't work. So they said, could you help us with the software part? We said, of course we can, send it to us. And they quite point blank asked us, could you turn this around in 6 weeks? And we looked at it and said, holy cow, there's a lot of stuff on the software. I don't think we could turn the software around in 6 weeks. We said, let's get started at least. And one of our guys I thought was great in that moment. He asked, where is the deadline coming from? Is it coming from investors? And immediately the head of engineering said, yeah, of course. And we thought, wow, this company is under so much pressure, and clearly the investor doesn't understand. They understand their own pressure, but clearly they don't understand what's involved here. We said, there's no way we're turning around in 6 weeks, but let's get started. And we did some great work, and they were happy with us, and they said, could you look at the rest of it? And we said, sure. And even the big house said, go ahead, take it. We'll send it to you, we'll refer to you and you guys take it. And we ended up getting a biocomp and sterility expert on board. And she went through all the biocompatibility, all the packaging sterility, and they had to redo all of it, and it took a year and a half. And they asked us, can you help us turn it around in 6 weeks? And thankfully we said, guys, I don't think so. This is really, really a lot of feedback. And she was answering questions on the pre-IDE review. A year and a half later, she answered the last few questions. So again, preparing, what level you need to be at, it depends on your very, very specific case. But I can't stress enough how preparation is critical, and what would be the solution to that challenge would be to get into a pre-IDE meeting. I can't understand why they did not get into a pre-IDE meeting. In other words, this is what we're planning. Do you agree? It would have saved them a ton of time and money. Yeah.
I'm just curious if you have any opinions on the utility of breakthrough and how it kind of fits into all this stuff, because I know it's like everyone's really excited, and now I feel it's kind of, I don't know if anyone's experienced a benefit from it. So
Yeah.
want to hear your perspective.
I like the breakthrough a lot.
Yeah.
And I saw that exponential change happen. So there was 20 of them, there was 40 of them, and then there was 450 of them. It happened very quickly at one point. I love it because it allows you to collaborate closely with the FDA. That's basically what the breakthrough is. Accelerated or not really depends on you. But what I like is it's concierge service from the FDA. I don't know if I should call it service, but it's a nice collaborative infrastructure that you get into. They give you a project manager and you have access to them. You don't have to wait. So really what you're doing is what we've been talking about, is having a curated preparation and development of your data development plan. So what you're doing is working closely with the FDA on your DDP. And what have we been talking about? Ensuring that you are showing the safety and efficacy evidence that the FDA wants. How better to do that? Working hand in hand with the FDA. Now, the requirements, the criteria for acceptance are a little misunderstood. So we get a lot of, can we be breakthrough? We want to do a breakthrough. And the answer is, well, it's life-threatening and it's a better treatment or diagnostic. If you're not life-threatening, you don't even qualify. Let's not even get started. But what's nice now, I think the FDA have learned from this program, and they realize that when companies have a really compelling value proposition to the field, it's in everybody's best interest to work together to get it done right. So now they have the STEP program, which is like the FDA's, the breakthrough designation's little brother, little cousin, that doesn't require a life-threatening criteria. Now it's just better, we'll help you do it faster. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I like the breakthrough a lot. We've done a bunch of them, and when one goes through, it's really nice. It doesn't magically solve anything. The onus is still on you to do a ton of work. So often, the FDA is waiting. So we're available, the wait times are reduced, and you have direct access to us, and the FDA is waiting for you, because you have a lot of work to do. But it's nice to be working collaboratively with them for sure.
We're in the STEP program and it's super helpful. We've had 2 core sprints with FDA already, and they've been like so valuable.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, and they directly answer all your questions for a regulatory strategy. Like, the feedback is in the minutes, and you can just like go do as they say, and you should be on the right track.
Feedback is in the minutes.
Yeah.
Immediate feedback.
The feedback is always in the minutes.
Oh,
It's just everything that happened in the meeting.
No, not in minutes. You understand?
That's all right.
You're texting.
No, I'm texting you.
Finance service level.
There's an important article there in the minutes, in the meeting minutes, but you do have access to them. That's quite efficient, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. You have a project manager assigned to you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's wonderful. So I like it a lot. Everybody would like to be, meet the criteria. You have to make sure you meet the criteria.
So what are the criteria for that?
That's a great question. Well, how did you meet the criteria?
So you have to be enhance patient safety in a significant manner. I mean, you just Google it and it's right there. I can't remember exactly.
Yeah, you're providing a more efficient, efficacious, safe and efficacious way to address a clinical issue that exists, but that is not life-threatening. So in the breakthrough, the life-threatening is the threshold.
And with the FDA to double check your policies. Is that a
I think you're answering me no, right?
No,
Yeah.
no, they're separate. They're two different things. So we applied for STEP, and we also did our Q-sub, but independently. And there's nothing in the Q-sub about being applicable for a STEP or breakthrough. At least.
So the answer is in the breakthrough and the STEP programs, they tell you that you can't ask them if you're applicable in a pre-sub.
Yeah, same.
Because there would be 1,000 pre-subs a month asking them if they're right.
Same for us, because they promise answer to that breakthrough application in 30 days. And it takes 75 plus 15 and 90
get
days to
Q-sub.
get to the pre-sub. So you can spend the 30 days waiting, they reply to your breakthrough application, already working on your pre-submission, shortening that time, that if it comes back, no, you already 30 days ahead with your pre-submission, that's parallel track.
And can you apply for the step or breakthrough too early?
But you can do all of this too early. You can do all of it too late, and you can do all of it too early. So again, back to when do you do a pre-sub, the answer is, or when to not do a pre-sub, the answer is you need to be ready to show that you meet the criteria. So if you say, we meet the criteria and your argument is flimsy, you might need to do more homework to meet that argument. So we like to put a lot into that application. And the other reason I really like the breakthrough, I forgot to answer this, is that whether you get it or not, you've done a lot of work to synthesize some very important aspects of your technology. So more often than not, the pre-submission document that we put together or the breakthrough application becomes the most comprehensive and up-to-date description of the technology in the clinical case. And then the company starts to take from that to put into their documentation. Because you force everyone around the table to answer the question. How will it be used? Well, this way. Well, that way. Well, guys, can we reach a consensus? Well, there's some work to do before we answer that question. Yeah. And when you do that work, then you have the argument for the validity and the applicability of your technology all in one place, nice and concise. It shouldn't be 2,000 pages. We're back in our sweet spot of 20, 25 pages. Pre-submission, 20, 25 pages. Breakthrough, 20, 25 pages. But you better believe we're talking about the existing standard of care, the burden on on the healthcare system, the quality of life of the patient. You should have that in your marketing somewhere, right?
I think a lot of consultants will tell you that it can never be too early for the Q-sub, but I think it can be, because there's also a strategy in like what you want to talk about with the FDA and like how many curtains you want to unveil and at what time. And
It's very important to understand that.
And I think the consultants are very often just so interested in like having you as kind of doing these Q-sub meetings because they know how to do that application, but it can be such an integral part of your like later regulatory strategy that it can definitely be too soon. But you want to do it early at the same time. It's not too early.
I'm happy to hear you answer that. Because coming from me, it's very self-serving. We don't like to do work just to do it. So we always challenge the teams to say, are you ready? And are you ready means, can you answer these questions in a very concise, comprehensive way with literature, by the way, 30, 40 references in those little 20 pages, right? So we like to work with the companies to prepare that and make sure that it's robust before we send it in. So I love that answer. A lot of consultants just want to file it because they're charging, and that's what they do. We don't like to do work for it's worse than that. We don't like to do work that could potentially put you in the wrong position, right? So we put it back on you and say, are you prepared to answer these questions? How much do you know about your tech? You guys are on a very, very tight schedule. I'll share these slides with Nicole. This is how you can get in touch with us, but the information that we talked about is in there. And thank you very, very, very much for being with us today. We really, really appreciate it.